January 17th, 1945, somewhere along the frost-cracked roads of Belgium, the morning arrives without fanfare. Snow falls in silent curtains across the Ardennes forest, burying the scars of battle beneath a blanket of deceptive peace. In a converted schoolhouse 10 miles behind the front lines, steam rises from metal kettles. The windows, shattered weeks earlier by artillery, have been covered with canvas tarps that snap and billow in the wind. Inside, rows of cots stretch along what was once a classroom where children learned arithmetic and French verbs. Now it holds the broken bodies of war. An American nurse, Lieutenant Margaret Hastings of the Army Nurse Corps, moves between the beds with practiced efficiency. Her uniform is stained with blood that no amount of washing will ever fully remove. She is 24 years old. Her hands, chapped raw from constant washing in the bitter cold, carry a basin of warm water and clean bandages. She pauses at the end of the row where the German prisoners lie. The man on the cot before her cannot be more than 19. His leg, shattered by shrapnel during the Battle of the Bulge, has been set and splinted by American surgeons. The wound weeps through the dressing. He watches her approach with eyes that expect nothing but the continuation of suffering. He has been taught that the Americans are barbaric, that they execute prisoners, that mercy is a weakness they do not possess. He braces himself for pain. She sets down the base. She does not speak his language, and he does not speak hers, but she smiles, briefly, tiredly, and begins to unwrap the soiled bandage with a gentleness that makes no sense to him. Her touch is careful. She works as though his pain matters, as though he is not the enemy, as though he is simply a young man far from home with a wound that needs tending. When she finishes, she places a hand on his shoulder for just a moment. The gesture breaks something inside him. He turns his face away so she will not see him weep. This moment, small, unremarkable, repeated in field hospitals and aid stations across Europe, represents a collision between ideology and reality that would shatter the carefully constructed worldview of thousands of German soldiers. They had been raised in a system that preached racial superiority, national destiny, and the fundamental weakness of democratic societies. They had been told that Americans were soft, corrupted by materialism and racial mixing, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice that defined the German warrior spirit. They had been taught that in war, the strong dominated the weak, and mercy was the luxury of those who could afford to lose. And then they were captured, and then they met the nurses. To understand the magnitude of this psychological rupture, one must first understand what these young men had been told, what they believed, and what they expected when the moment of capture arrived. The Nazi regime had spent 12 years constructing a comprehensive worldview that permeated every aspect of German society. From the moment a child entered school, they were immersed in propaganda that emphasized German racial superiority, the righteousness of territorial expansion, and the fundamental degeneracy of Germany's enemies. The Hitler Youth, the schools, the radio broadcasts, the newspapers, the films, all reinforced the same message. Germany represented civilization, order, and strength, while its enemies embodied chaos, weakness, and racial pollution. American society, in particular, was portrayed as a mongrel nation, weakened by democracy, corrupted by Jewish influence, and incapable of producing warriors worthy of respect. Nazi propagandists pointed to America's racial diversity as evidence of its fundamental weakness. How could a nation of mixed races and competing interests possibly stand against the unified will of the German Volk? American soldiers, they were told, were poorly trained, poorly led, and motivated only by material gain rather than ideological conviction. When confronted with determined German resistance, the propaganda promised American forces would crumble. The treatment of prisoners of war, according to this worldview, would naturally reflect the moral bankruptcy of the captor. German soldiers were instructed that capture meant humiliation, torture, and likely execution. Soviet prisoners, they had been told, were treated with unimaginable brutality by German forces, and they were led to believe that this was simply the natural order of war. The strong punished the weak. The victor had no obligation to show mercy to the vanquished. This was not cruelty. It was simply reality. For the young soldier lying on that cot in Belgium, This ideology had been the framework through which he understood the world. He had joined the Wehrmacht believing in German invincibility. He had fought believing that his cause was just. And when the tides of war turned against him, when he found himself wounded and surrounded, when American soldiers approached his position with weapons raised, he had expected the end. He had expected punishment for his resistance. He had expected to pay the price for belonging to the losing side. What he encountered instead was incomprehensible within the framework he had been given. The journey from frontline capture to treatment in an American field hospital was itself a revelation that began the process of ideological disintegration. When German soldiers were captured, they were immediately processed according to the protocols established by the Geneva Convention, a document that Nazi Germany had signed but frequently violated. American soldiers were trained in the proper treatment of prisoners of war. They were instructed to search prisoners for weapons and intelligence, to provide medical treatment for wounds, and to ensure that prisoners were fed, sheltered, and protected from harm. For many German prisoners, the first shock came in the form of a cigarette. American soldiers, after securing their weapons and conducting searches, often offered cigarettes to the men they had just been fighting. This gesture, casual, almost reflexive for the Americans, was staggering to the Germans. In the Wehrmacht, supplies were scarce. Cigarettes were precious. The idea that a captor would share such a commodity with a prisoner contradicted everything they had been told about American character. The second shock came with food. At prisoner collection points, captured Germans were given rations, often the same C rations or K rations that American soldiers ate. The food was adequate, sometimes abundant. There was coffee, real coffee, in quantities that seemed wasteful to men who had been subsisting on ersatz coffee made from acorns and barley for years. There was chocolate, there was canned meat, there was white bread. Private Hans Müller, captured near Bastogne in January 1945, later wrote in his memoirs about the moment he was given an American K ration. "I thought it was a trick. I thought they were testing us to see if we would take the food, and then they would punish us for it. But the American soldier simply handed me the box and walked away. Inside was more food than I had seen in a single meal in 2 years. Crackers, cheese, chocolate, instant coffee, cigarettes. I sat there holding it, unable to understand. We had been told they were starving. We had been told their economy was in ruins. And here they were giving this abundance to their enemies." This pattern repeated itself thousands of times across the European theater. German soldiers, expecting brutality, encountered instead a systematic adherence to international law and, more surprisingly, something that resembled kindness. American military police who guarded prisoner convoys ensured that the men were sheltered from the weather, that they received medical attention, that they were not abused. There were, of course, violations. War crimes occurred on all sides, and not every American soldier behaved honorably. But the systematic treatment of prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards represented official policy and was generally enforced. By the time wounded prisoners reached field hospitals and evacuation hospitals, they had already begun to experience cognitive dissonance. The reality of their treatment contradicted the ideology they had been taught. But it was in the hospitals, under the care of American medical personnel, that the dissonance became unbearable. The American military medical system in World War II represented an extraordinary organizational achievement. The Army Nurse Corps, which had numbered fewer than 7,000 nurses when the war began, expanded to more than 59,000 nurses by war's end. These women, for they were almost exclusively women, bound by the gender norms of their era, underwent rigorous training in military medicine, trauma care, and field sanitation. They served in field hospitals, evacuation hospitals, and general hospitals, moving with the armies as they advanced across Europe and the Pacific. The nurses worked under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced medical professionals. Field hospitals were established in commandeered buildings, in tents, sometimes in the open air. They operated within artillery range of German positions. They endured the same cold, the same danger, the same exhaustion as the soldiers they treated. They performed triage under fire, deciding in seconds who might be saved and who was beyond help. They held the hands of dying men, They wrote letters to mothers and wives. They worked shifts that lasted 20 hours, then collapsed on cots for a few hours of fitful sleep before beginning again. And they treated everyone: American soldiers, British soldiers, French civilians, and German prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Julia Flick, superintendent of the Army Nurse Corps during the war, emphasized this principle in her training directives. A wounded man is a wounded man, regardless of the uniform he wears. Our obligation is to the relief of suffering. This was not merely idealistic rhetoric. It was official policy, enforced by military regulations and reinforced by the professional ethos of the medical personnel themselves. The Geneva Convention required that medical facilities treat wounded prisoners with the same standard of care provided to a nation's own forces. And the American military medical system took this obligation seriously. For the German prisoners who found themselves in American hospitals, this created a profound psychological crisis. The nurses who tended their wounds did not treat them with contempt or indifference. They did not provide substandard care. They did not abandon them to suffer. Instead, they worked with the same dedication, the same skill, and often the same compassion that they showed to American wounded. Nurse Helen Molyneux, who served with the 128th Evacuation Hospital through France and Germany, recorded in her diary the experience of treating German prisoners. At first, they are terrified. They watch us with eyes full of fear and suspicion. They expect punishment. Some of them cry. Some of them cry. Some of them try to refuse treatment, as though accepting our help is a form of betrayal. But we simply treat them. We clean their wounds, we change their dressings, we give them morphine for the pain. And slowly you can see something change in their faces. The fear fades. Sometimes it's replaced by confusion. Sometimes by gratitude. Sometimes they weep. The weeping was reported by numerous nurses and medical personnel. Hardened soldiers, men who had endured the brutal combat of the Eastern Front and the desperate fighting of the Western Front, broke down when confronted with the simple act of compassionate medical care. They wept not just from pain or fear, but from the shattering of their ideological certainty. Everything they had been told was a lie. The enemy was not monstrous. The enemy was not cruel. The enemy was, in fact, more humane than their own propaganda had ever admitted. Consider the symbolic weight of the bandage. In the grand narrative of war, the bandage is a minor object, sterile cotton cloth, perhaps gauze, designed to protect wounds from infection and absorb blood. But for the German prisoners, the bandage became something more. It became evidence of a truth that contradicted everything they thought they knew. When a German soldier was wounded in action, treatment depended on luck and circumstances. The Wehrmacht Medical Corps was competent but overstretched, particularly as the war dragged on and resources became scarce. Supplies of morphine, sulfa drugs, and bandages dwindled. By 1944 and 1945, German hospitals were overwhelmed, undersupplied, and often targeted by Allied bombing. Wounded soldiers sometimes waited days for treatment. Gangrene and infection were common. Amputation was often the only option for limbs that might have been saved with better supplies and earlier intervention. In American field hospitals, supplies were abundant. The United States had the industrial capacity to produce medical supplies in quantities that seemed almost incomprehensible to German prisoners. Bandages, morphine, sulfa powder, penicillin, all were available in quantities sufficient not just for American wounded but for prisoners as well. This was not accident or generosity. It was logistics. The American war economy had mobilized on a scale unprecedented in human history. Factories that once produced consumer goods now produced the materials of war and the materials of healing in equal measure. When an American nurse unwrapped a sterile bandage to dress a German prisoner's wound, she was handling an object that represented the entire productive capacity of the American industrial system. That bandage had been manufactured in a factory in Pennsylvania or Ohio, packaged by workers who had never seen combat, shipped across the Atlantic on convoys protected by destroyers, transported to the front in trucks driven by Red Ball Express drivers, and distributed to field hospitals by a logistics system of staggering complexity. And it was being used to heal an enemy. The prisoner understood none of this complexity, but he understood the essential truth. The bandage was clean, fresh, abundant. There would be another bandage tomorrow, and another the day after. The morphine that dulled his pain was administered without hesitation. The sulfa powder that prevented infection was applied liberally. The penicillin that saved his life was given as though it were routine. This was the symbolism that shattered ideology. The Nazi regime had promised that Germany represented the pinnacle of civilization, that the 1,000-year Reich would establish order and prosperity for the Aryan race. But here in defeat, German soldiers encountered an abundance they had never known under their own system. The democratic nation they had been taught to despise was treating them with a level of care and humanity that their own regime had never provided even to its own people. The transformation of perception did not happen instantly. Ideology is not easily abandoned, especially when it has provided meaning and purpose for years. For many German prisoners, the initial reaction to humane treatment was suspicion. They assumed the kindness was temporary, a ploy to extract information. They assumed that once they had been interrogated, the true brutality would emerge. They assumed that the care they received was an anomaly, not representative of American character. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the evidence accumulated. The food kept coming. The medical care continued. The guards, while maintaining discipline, did not engage in gratuitous cruelty. Prisoners were housed in barracks or camps where conditions, while far from comfortable, were vastly superior to what many had experienced in the Wehrmacht. They were allowed to write letters home. They were given access to the International Red Cross. They were treated according to the laws of war. Slowly, reluctantly, many began to accept that their treatment was not an elaborate deception, but rather a reflection of something fundamental about American values. The system they had fought against was not weak but strong enough to afford mercy. The democratic principles they had been taught to despise were not signs of degeneracy, but rather foundations for a more humane society. This realization was not universal. Some prisoners clung to Nazi ideology until the end of their lives, rationalizing their treatment as an exception, or refusing to acknowledge that their beliefs had been wrong. But for many, perhaps most, the experience of captivity initiated a process of ideological reevaluation that would continue for years. The letters that German prisoners were allowed to send home provide testimony to this transformation. Although censored by military authorities to prevent transmission of intelligence, these letters often expressed surprise at the conditions of captivity. "We are treated well," one prisoner wrote to his family in Bavaria, "better than I expected, better than we treated the Russians." Another wrote, "The nurses here care for us as though we were their own. I do not understand it, but I am grateful." Some letters went further, explicitly questioning the propaganda they had been taught. "Everything they told us was lies," wrote a prisoner hospitalized in France. "The Americans are not what we were told. They are not weak. They are not cruel. I begin to wonder what else we were told was false." These letters, when they reached Germany, often had a multiplier effect. Families who received them shared the information with neighbors and friends. The reality of American treatment of prisoners contradicted the propaganda still being broadcast by the Nazi regime, which insisted until the very end that Germany was winning, that the enemy was barbaric, that surrender meant death. For the German civilian population, increasingly desperate and disillusioned as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, these letters provided evidence that the regime had been lying about many things. The experience of the nurses themselves provides another dimension to this story. These were women who had volunteered for military service, who had left homes and families to serve in a war zone, who had witnessed horrors that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. They had tended American soldiers whose bodies had been shredded by artillery, burned by explosions, broken by bullets. They had held dying men who called out for mothers who would never see them again. They had seen the cost of war in the most intimate, visceral terms. And yet they treated the German prisoners with the same care they gave to Americans. This was not easy. It required them to look past the uniform, past the knowledge that these men had fought for a regime responsible for unspeakable atrocities, past their own grief and exhaustion, and see simply another wounded human being in need of care. Some nurses struggled with this obligation. In their letters and diaries, they wrote about the moral complexity of caring for the enemy. How could one tend the wounds of a German soldier with compassion, knowing that he might have killed American soldiers? How could one maintain professional detachment when every German prisoner represented lost American lives? The answer for most lay in the fundamental principles of medical ethics and in their own humanity. Nurse Elizabeth Pfeiffer, who served in England and France, wrote, "When I see a wounded German, I do not see a Nazi. I see a boy who is frightened and in pain, far from home, wondering if he will ever see his family again. I see what my brother might be, if circumstances had been different, and I treat him as I would want someone to treat my brother." This ability to recognize shared humanity across the lines of war was not weakness, but rather a profound strength. It reflected the democratic values that the Allies were fighting to preserve, the belief that individuals possess inherent worth regardless of nationality, that mercy is not incompatible with justice, that the measure of a civilization lies not in how it treats its friends, but in how it treats its enemies. For the German prisoners, witnessing this capacity for compassion in the face of justified anger was perhaps the most powerful argument against the ideology they had been taught. The Nazi worldview held that humans were fundamentally divided by race, that conflict between groups was inevitable and necessary, that strength meant the domination of the weak. But the American nurses demonstrated a different possibility, that humans could choose compassion even when it was difficult, that principles could guide behavior even under the worst circumstances, that a society could be both powerful and humane. The psychological impact of this revelation extended beyond individual prisoners. As the war ended, and prisoners began to be repatriated to Germany, they carried with them the memory of their treatment. In the shattered landscape of post-war Germany, amid the ruins of cities and the ruins of ideology, these memories became part of the foundation for reconstruction. The Allied occupation authorities understood that rebuilding Germany required not just physical reconstruction, but also ideological transformation. The denazification program sought to dismantle the structures of Nazi ideology and replace them with democratic values. This was an immense undertaking, complicated by the fact that millions of Germans had been complicit in or supportive of the Nazi regime. How does one re-educate an entire nation? Part of the answer lay in the experiences of the prisoners themselves. Men who had been captured and treated humanely returned home with testimony that contradicted the propaganda they had once believed. They told their families about the food they had received, the medical care, the adherence to Geneva Convention protocols. They spoke of American nurses who had cared for their wounds with gentleness and skill. These stories, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of repatriated prisoners, provided evidence that democracy was not weak, that Americans were not barbaric, that the Allied victory represented not just military superiority but also moral legitimacy. This was not a swift or easy process. Germany's ideological transformation took years, even generations. The experience of defeat, occupation, and reconstruction was traumatic for many Germans, and the temptations of nostalgia for Nazi ideology persisted in some quarters for decades. But the foundation for democratic reconstruction existed in part because so many Germans had encountered, in the most direct possible way, evidence that their former enemies were capable of behaving with honor and humanity. Historians have debated the extent to which humane treatment of prisoners contributed to post-war reconciliation and democratization. Some argue that structural factors, economic aid through the Marshall Plan, political reforms imposed by occupation authorities, the geopolitical realities of the Cold War, were more significant than individual experiences. Others contend that ideology cannot be changed through force alone, that the psychological transformation of individual Germans view as essential to the success of democratization. The truth likely encompasses both perspectives. Material reconstruction and political reform were necessary conditions for Germany's transformation, but they would not have been sufficient without a corresponding shift in values and beliefs. And for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, that shift began in American field hospitals, when they encountered nurses who treated their wounds as though they were brothers. There is a particular poignancy in the image of the nurse and the prisoner, the woman who heals and the man who fought. In the gendered symbolism of war, men are soldiers and women are mothers, nurses, symbols of home and peace. The Nazi regime had embraced this symbolism with particular fervor, relegating women to the role of mothers and homemakers, emphasizing their duty to produce children for the fatherland. The ideal German woman was domestic, submissive, apolitical. American women, by contrast, had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war. They built airplanes and ships, managed farms, served as nurses and doctors. They demonstrated that competence and strength were not exclusively masculine traits, that women could contribute to the war effort in roles beyond the domestic sphere. The Army Nurse Corps was one manifestation of this expanded role, and the nurses who served in Europe embodied a challenge to Nazi gender ideology as profound as their challenge to racial ideology. For a German soldier to be tended by an American nurse was thus doubly disorienting. Not only was he receiving compassionate care from an enemy, but that enemy was a woman operating with an independence and authority that his own ideology had denied was possible. The nurse was not a passive symbol, but an active agent, making life and death decisions, commanding respect from male soldiers and physicians, exercising skills that required years of training and extraordinary courage. In memoirs and oral histories, some German prisoners recalled this aspect of their treatment with particular vividness. They had been taught that women were weak, that their place was in the home, that they were incapable of the rigors of military life. And yet the nurses who treated them worked under conditions of extraordinary hardship, maintained discipline and professionalism under fire, and demonstrated a competence that contradicted every assumption they had been taught. I remember one nurse in particular, wrote former Wehrmacht Sergeant Klaus Brenner in a memoir published in the 1980s. She could not have been more than 25 years old. She worked for hours without rest, moving from one patient to another, never showing exhaustion or fear even when we could hear the artillery in the distance. She changed my bandages with hands that were steady and sure. She gave orders to the orderlies, and they obeyed without question. I had never seen a German woman in such a role. It made me wonder what else we had been wrong about. The conditions under which American nurses worked deserve fuller consideration, for they provide context for the magnitude of what they accomplished. Field hospitals and evacuation hospitals were established as close to the front lines as safety permitted, sometimes only 5 or 10 miles behind active combat. They were targets. German artillery sometimes shelled medical facilities, either deliberately or through misidentification. Nurses worked in tents or hastily converted buildings that offered minimal protection from the elements. In winter, temperatures inside the hospitals often dropped below freezing. In summer, the heat was stifling. The work was relentless. During major offensives or defensive operations, casualties flooded the hospitals in waves. Wounded men arrived on stretchers, in ambulances, sometimes carried by their comrades. Triage nurses assessed each arrival in seconds, assigning them to categories based on the severity of their wounds and their likelihood of survival. Those who could wait were set aside. Those who needed immediate surgery were rushed to operating rooms. Those who were beyond help were given morphine and made as comfortable as possible. The surgical teams worked around the clock. Nurses assisted in operations, maintaining sterile fields, handing instruments to surgeons, monitoring patients under anesthesia. They administered blood transfusions, changed dressings, recorded patient information. They cleaned wounds, debrided necrotic tissue, applied sulfa powder and penicillin. They held basins while patients vomited from anesthesia. They emptied bedpans, changed soiled sheets, bathed patients who could not care for themselves, and through it all, they maintained a professional demeanor that provided psychological comfort to the wounded. The patients, American and German alike, needed to believe that they were in capable hands, that the nurses knew what they were doing, that they would survive. The nurses provided that reassurance even when they themselves were terrified, exhausted, uncertain. The emotional toll was severe. Many nurses suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the wounded and dying men they had treated. They struggled with guilt over the patients they could not save. They carried the weight of others' suffering in ways that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Yet they continued. They continued because they had volunteered for this service, because they believed in the cause for which the Allies fought, because their professional ethics demanded it, and because the wounded, all the wounded, needed them. For the German prisoners, the dedication of these nurses was incomprehensible within the framework of Nazi ideology. The regime had taught that sacrifice and dedication were virtues exclusive to the German people, that other nations lacked the spiritual strength to endure hardship for a higher purpose. But here were American women enduring extraordinary hardship, not for territorial conquest or racial dominance, but simply to heal the wounded, including the wounded enemies of their nation. This was the power of example. No propaganda, no speeches, no ideological instruction could compete with the direct experience of witnessing such dedication. The nurses became, without intending to, ambassadors for democratic values, not through what they said, but through what they did. It is worth examining specific cases to understand the individual dimensions of this collective experience. The historical record preserves some accounts of particular encounters between nurses and prisoners, moments when the human connection transcended the categories of war. One such account comes from Lieutenant Sarah Whitman, who served with the 45th Field Hospital in Germany in the spring of 1945. In a letter to her sister, she described treating a German soldier who had been shot in the abdomen. The wound was severe, and he had developed peritonitis. The surgeons operated, but his chances of survival were poor. He remained in the hospital for weeks, hovering between life and death, racked by fever and pain. Whitman found herself checking on him frequently, administering morphine, adjusting his position to ease his discomfort, talking to him even though neither understood the other's language. "I do not know why I became so invested in his survival," she wrote. "Perhaps because he was so young. Perhaps because he reminded me of my brother. Perhaps because I needed to believe that all this work, all this suffering, could result in life rather than death." The soldier eventually recovered. On the day he was well enough to be transferred to a prisoner of war camp, he asked through a translator to speak with her. Through tears, he thanked her and told her that she had given him back his life. He said that he would remember her always, that he would tell his children about the American nurse who cared for him when he was her enemy. He asked if he could write to her after the war. "I did not know what to say," Whitman wrote. "I had simply done my job, what I was trained to do." But for him, it was more than that. It was proof that the world was not what he had been told. "I wonder what will become of him, whether he will make it home, whether he will remember me as clearly as he thinks he will. I hope he does. I hope he tells his children. I hope he tells everyone." Another account comes from a German prisoner, whose testimony was recorded by American military psychologists studying the attitudes of prisoners of war. The prisoner, whose name was not recorded, described his experience in an evacuation hospital after being wounded in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. He had fought for 3 years on the Eastern Front before being transferred to France. He had seen atrocities committed by both sides. He had participated in actions that he later described as unforgivable. When he was captured, he expected execution. Instead, he was treated for his wounds and transported to a hospital. There, an African-American nurse treated him. This was for him the ultimate shock. He had been taught that black people were subhuman, that they were incapable of intelligence or civilization, that their presence in American society was evidence of its degeneracy. And here was a black woman, educated, competent, treating his wounds with skill and care. She was a nurse, he told the psychologist. A real nurse. She knew what she was doing. She was gentle but efficient. She talked to me even though I could not understand her, and her voice was kind. I'd been taught that people like her were animals, but she was more human than I had been. Everything I believed was wrong. Everything. This testimony, preserved in military archives, captures the totality of ideological collapse. The prisoner's worldview had been built on assumptions of racial hierarchy, and a single encounter with a competent, compassionate black nurse demolished those assumptions. It is impossible to know what became of this particular man, whether he carried that realization into a transformed life, or whether the weight of his past actions crushed him. but his testimony stands as evidence of the power of direct experience to challenge even the most deeply ingrained beliefs. The symbolism of food reappears throughout these accounts, not as a minor detail, but as a central element of the prisoner's transformation. The abundance of American rations became, for many prisoners, the most tangible evidence of the superiority of the democratic economic system. This was not abstract ideology, but concrete reality. The Americans had more food, better food, food to spare even for their enemies. The Nazi regime had promised prosperity and plenty for the German people, but by 1944 and 1945, Germans were starving. The wartime economy, focused entirely on military production, could not provide adequate food for the civilian population. Rations were meager and constantly reduced. Bread was made from sawdust and other fillers. Meat was a rare luxury. Coffee, chocolate, and sugar were distant memories for most Germans. German soldiers, particularly those on the Eastern Front, often survived on inadequate rations supplemented by foraging and, in some cases, theft from occupied populations. Hunger was a constant companion. The Wehrmacht's logistics system, while initially effective, collapsed under the strain of fighting on multiple fronts. By late in the war, German soldiers were sometimes going days without adequate food, and then they were captured and they were given American rations. K-rations, designed to provide a complete meal in a compact package, contained crackers, canned meat, cheese, candy, instant coffee, cigarettes, and chewing gum. To a starving German soldier, this was a feast. The fact that these rations were standard issue for every American soldier, that there were millions of such packages produced and distributed, was staggering. In prisoner of war camps, the food continued. Prisoners received 3 meals a day, meals that met minimum caloric requirements and often exceeded them. There was bread, real bread made from wheat flour. There was meat. There were vegetables. The food was not gourmet cuisine, but it was adequate and abundant. For many prisoners, they ate better as captives of the Americans than they had as soldiers of the Wehrmacht. This abundance was not accidental. The United States, protected by oceans from the fighting, had experienced no disruption to its agricultural production. American farms, increasingly mechanized, produced more food than the nation needed. The government purchased surplus production and converted it into military rations. The logistics system that delivered those rations to Europe was a marvel of organizational efficiency. Trains, ships, trucks, warehouses, all coordinated to ensure that American soldiers were well fed. And because American soldiers were well fed, prisoners were well fed. The Geneva Convention required adequate nutrition for prisoners, and the United States had the capacity to meet that requirement. For the prisoners, the food was not just sustenance but symbol. It represented the productive capacity of a free economy, the organizational competence of a democratic government, and the willingness of the American people to extend, even to their enemies, the basic necessities of life. Some prisoners explicitly made this connection. In interviews conducted after the war, former prisoners described how their experience of American food changed their understanding of economic systems. They had been taught that capitalism was exploitative, that it produced wealth for a few while impoverishing the masses, that it was inherently unstable and inferior to the planned economy of the Nazi state. But the evidence of their senses contradicted this teaching. The capitalist economy had produced abundance on a scale that the Nazi economy never achieved. The workers in American factories were not impoverished slaves but free laborers, who were productive precisely because they were free. This realization undermined one of the central tenets of Nazi ideology. If democracy and capitalism could produce such abundance, if they could mobilize entire economies for war while still feeding both soldiers and prisoners, then perhaps the Nazi critique of democratic systems was fundamentally flawed. Perhaps freedom was not a weakness, but a strength. The nurses and the food, the bandages and the cigarettes, these small elements of daily experience accumulated into a comprehensive challenge to everything the prisoners had believed. But the transformation was not merely intellectual. It was emotional, visceral, deeply personal. The prisoners had not just learned new facts about American society. They had experienced a different way of being treated, a different set of values in action. Many prisoners described feeling shame, not just the shame of military defeat, but a deeper shame at having fought for a cause that was revealed to be morally bankrupt. They had participated in a war of aggression, had served a regime that committed genocide, had believed lies that seemed obvious in retrospect. The kindness they received from American medical personnel did not erase their culpability, but it did provide a model for a different way of living. Some prisoners used their time in captivity to reflect on their choices and to begin the process of moral reckoning. They read books that had been banned in Nazi Germany. They engaged in discussions with fellow prisoners who questioned the ideology they had once shared. They wrote letters and journals that explored their own responsibility for the crimes of the regime they had served. This process of reflection was encouraged by American authorities, who recognized that the post-war reconstruction of Germany would require not just physical rebuilding, but also ideological transformation. Prisoner of war camps in the United States and Europe included educational programs designed to introduce prisoners to democratic principles. Prisoners attended lectures on American history and government, watched films about democratic societies, and participated in discussions about freedom and human rights. The effectiveness of these programs varied. Some prisoners embraced the opportunity for education and emerged from captivity as committed Democrats. Others rejected the programs as enemy propaganda, clinging to their Nazi beliefs despite the evidence of their experience. Most fell somewhere in between, uncertain, confused, trying to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had experienced. But even the skeptics could not easily dismiss the fact of their treatment. The nurses had been real, the food had been real, the adherence to Geneva Convention standards had been real. These were not abstract principles or propaganda talking points, but concrete experiences that could not be explained away. The epilogue of this story extends far beyond the end of the war. The German prisoners who received medical care from American nurses returned to a Germany that was physically and morally devastated. The cities were ruins. The economy was shattered. Millions were dead. The Nazi regime that had promised a 1,000-year empire had collapsed after only 12 years, leaving behind a legacy of genocide, destruction, and shame. In the decades that followed, West Germany underwent a transformation that remains one of the most remarkable in modern history. A nation that had embraced totalitarianism and committed unspeakable atrocities became a stable democracy, a prosperous economy, and a responsible member of the international community. The process was neither easy nor complete. The ghosts of the Nazi era continue to haunt German society, but the fundamental transformation was real. Many factors contributed to this transformation: the Marshall Plan's economic assistance, the Allied occupation's political reforms, the leadership of figures like Konrad Adenauer, the broader context of the Cold War. But underlying all these structural factors was a shift in values and beliefs at the individual level. Germans had to be willing to reject the ideology of the Nazi era and embrace democratic principles. They had to be willing to acknowledge the crimes of the past and commit to a different future. For some Germans, the seeds of that willingness were planted in American field hospitals, in the moments when nurses treated their wounds with compassion, when they received food from the hands of their enemies, when they encountered evidence that democracy was not weakness but strength. These were small moments in the vast sweep of history, easily overlooked, but they mattered. They mattered because they provided individual Germans with direct experience of an alternative to the ideology that had destroyed their nation. The nurses who served in World War II did not set out to transform German society. They set out to heal the wounded. They did their jobs with skill and dedication, guided by professional ethics and human compassion. They could not have imagined that their actions would contribute to the ideological transformation of an entire nation. But history works through such small actions, through individual choices to show mercy when vengeance would be easier, to uphold principles when expediency would be simpler. In the end, the story of German prisoners and American nurses is a story about the power of humanity to transcend ideology. It is a story about the strength that comes from adhering to principles, even when doing so is difficult. It is a story about the possibility of redemption, not in the sense of erasing past wrongs, but in the sense of choosing a different path forward. The young German soldier who wept when an American nurse tended his wound carried that moment with him for the rest of his life. It did not erase his participation in an unjust war. It did not absolve him of his responsibility for the choices he made, but it gave him evidence that another way of living was possible, that humans could choose compassion over cruelty, that societies could be built on principles of human dignity rather than domination. The nurse who treated him returned home when the war ended, put away her uniform, and tried to resume a normal life. She carried with her the memories of all the wounded men she had treated, the ones who survived and the ones who did not, the Americans and the Germans, the friends and the enemies. She had done her duty as she understood it, had upheld the principles she believed in, had maintained her humanity in circumstances that tested it to the limit. Neither of them thought of themselves as historical figures. They were simply people caught up in the vast machinery of war, trying to survive, trying to do what seemed right. But their encounter, multiplied thousands of times across the battlefields and hospitals of Europe, became part of the foundation on which a better world was built. The bandage, the cigarette, the meal, the gentle touch. These small acts of common humanity challenged an ideology built on hatred and domination. They proved that mercy was not weakness, that compassion was not incompatible with strength, that a democratic society could wage war effectively while still upholding its values. They demonstrated that freedom produced not just military power, but also moral legitimacy, that the American way of life was worth defending, precisely because it recognized the inherent worth of every human being, even the enemy. This is the legacy of those small moments in field hospitals across Europe. This is the truth that shattered the certainty of young men who had been raised to believe that might made right, that the strong had no obligation to the weak, that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. This is the lesson that could not be taught through propaganda or speeches or ideological instruction, but only through experience. The experience of being treated as a human being deserving of care and compassion, even in defeat, even by the enemy, even when one did not deserve it. In a world still scarred by war, still divided by ideology, still struggling with the question of how humans should treat one another across lines of nationality and belief, the story of the nurses and the prisoners offers a simple but profound answer. We are all in the end capable of suffering. We are all in the end in need of healing. And we are all in the end responsible for choosing whether to inflict pain or to relieve it, whether to diminish others or to recognize their humanity, whether to perpetuate the cycles of violence or to break them with acts of compassion. The German prisoners who broke down when American nurses treated their wounds like brothers learned this truth in the most direct possible way. They learned it not through words but through actions, not through ideology but through experience. And in learning it, they began the long, difficult process of building a different world, a world in which old enemies could become partners in peace, in which the scars of war could begin to heal, in which the terrible lessons of the past could guide humanity toward a more humane future. This is the meaning of those tears, shed in field hospitals across Europe by young men whose certainty had been shattered by kindness. This is the significance of the nurses who, in doing their duty, became witnesses to the possibility of redemption. This is the legacy that endures, long after the guns fell silent and the wounds healed, in the persistent belief that even in the darkest times, humanity can choose compassion, that even in war, there is space for mercy, and that even enemies can recognize in one another the shared burden and blessing of being human.